My name is Erica Lundy, Southwest Iowa Extension Beef Specialist with the Iowa Beef Center at Iowa State University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our Iowa Cow-Calf Production Systems Manual, a project that was in cooperation with 28 producers across the state of Iowa and the Iowa Beef Center at Iowa State. So the goal of this project was really to identify some production cost and benchmark some data from producers to really kind of get at best management practices of various cow systems here in Iowa. In this section, we're going to talk about specifically some of our soil and water resources and how those might impact different systems of cow-calf operations in the state. So a little bit of background on this project was really trying to get some producer data. And so for this project, we broke our cooperators in the project into 3 different systems. So the first is a traditional grazing system where those producers were grazing about 50% of the year, and the remainder of the year they were providing some stored feed to those animals. Our second group of producers was classified as our extensive grazing system. So really those were the producers that were trying to graze 75 or more percent of the year. So trying to graze as long as they could and have minimal stored feed into those systems. And then our third system was our limited grazing system, where they were really grazing less than 25% of the year. And those would include some of those systems where maybe they're in a dry lot or a confinement situation. So the goal of this project was really to develop some production benchmarks for producers to use and some decision tools to really help producers identify some areas and best management practices to help improve the cow-calf systems across Iowa. So we know that forages are beneficial to the Iowa landscape and for the soil and water quality in the state. So we really wanted to capture some best management practices of the farms across Iowa so we have a better idea of some of these management practices that can improve soil and water quality in the state. So in this section, we're really going to focus on some of the results of some soil sampling that was taken as a result of this project and look at some land use differences and how that might impact different systems of the cow-calf operations that were included in our project. So land values and land access is definitely a limiting factor in Iowa and has kind of been one of the main reasons for the interest in limited grazing systems the last several years here in the state. And so this table really kind of is summarizing different data sets and different sources to try to put an average value on our pasture acres and look at the return of investment that's broken out by our USDA crop reporting districts in the state. So that's kind of this first column over here on the left. So this is really trying to get at the question of, can I afford to put some low-end cropland into pasture or purchase some low-grade farmland and put that into pasture and make it work financially. So this data that we're using is kind of looking at pasture rent as our marker, and this data kind of says yes, that we can do that affordably. So the columns of interest here are really these two here that are looking at our rental rates and those farm sale prices and kind of getting at that return on investment. So based on this, we're in that ballpark of 2 to 3% return on investment based on these farm prices and the rental rates. And so that's saying that that's pretty comparable to what we would expect on the row crop side. So typically 2 to 3% return on investment is consistent with those crop acres in the state. So the next handful of slides here are kind of set up the same way, and really it's looking at soil erosion loss per acre based on some Russell II calculations and various soil samples that were taken from different production farms that were involved in this project. So you can see the counties there across the bottom. So this slide is looking at slope B class in the northern counties. So the next slide will be looking at some of those southern counties in the state as well. So there's lots of bars here, but basically in general, what this is saying is that anytime we use some tillage on various acres, that we are more prone to increase that soil erosion loss of those acres. So if we add a forage into our row crop acres, so the use of cover crops has been on the rise lately, we definitely reduce some of that risk, but it's still there for those acres where we have in crop production. So perennial pastures are definitely the best case scenario for reducing that soil erosion. So if we have our continuous pastures versus our rotational grazing pastures, we're a lot less prone to have some of that soil erosion. So those would be those bars here down on the end that are quite a bit smaller than the others. So just in kind of summary here in the northern counties at a slope of B, we're somewhere in that 1 to 2 tons of lost soil per year. Now when we move to those southern counties and kind of look at the same type of setup, basically we've almost doubled our risk of that soil erosion. So now for the most part we're somewhere in that 1.5 to 3 tons of soil loss per year when we implement some of these management systems like the tillage that we're seeing. On this slide, we're looking at the northern counties again, kind of that slope C categories, and you can see that now that we're on a steeper terrain that we're more prone to some of that soil loss. So in general, we're somewhere in that 2 to 3.5 tons of soil loss in the northern half of the state. And when we compare that to the southern half of the state, again, we see that change in our scale over here on the left. So now we're a lot more prone to soil erosion when we're in the southern counties and on a slope C basis. The last slope here is looking at D and back in the northern counties. So again, we've definitely seen an increase in the risk of that soil loss that we're more prone to when we're doing some of that row crop tillage, some of those other management practices. We're still at risk for losing a lot of soil. Our last set here is looking at those southern counties in that slope D. So these Appaloosa and Lucas County, now we're really exposed to a lot of risk of losing some of those soils. So just the slope of that land has a big impact on how much we're going to risk losing of those soil. But again, kind of down here in the bottom and those tail ends is where we see our continuous pasture and our rotational grazed pastures. So yes, we can implement some things like terraces, waterways, buffer strips to help reduce some of that risk of soil erosion, but really continuous forages is the best way to protect our soil from erosion. So forage acre fertility is something that's often overlooked in the beef cattle enterprises. So we worked with producers in this project to collect some soil samples on some of their hay and pasture acres to really kind of get an idea of where we sit in terms of some of these soil measurements. So really kind of what we're interested in here is looking at our organic matter. So over here, this column on the right, as we look down through here, we see this top chart is basically our northern Iowa, and the southern would be in the bottom table here. So we see lots of variability even on farms, but there's also several variations from location of those producers as well. So definitely some differences between our north and south and within our farms of our producers. So really, the organic matter that we see here is kind of surprising and relatively high to what one might expect. So typical row crop fields in Iowa are somewhere in that 2.5% to 5% organic matter. So these numbers here are on the higher end of that. And so that kind of suggests that these pastures and soil samples that were taken definitely has been something that's been in continuous forage acres for a long time, and that has had a ability to help build and maintain the organic matter that we see here. So we recommend that producer soil sample pastures and forage acres every 5 to 10 years, so we have a good idea of where those pastures are in terms of organic matter and other fertility measurements, and that way we can help make sure that we're maintaining and building those soil fertility and ultimately increasing the forage production that we're taking off of those. So utilizing manure is a really good way to help build some of that soil fertility as well. So manure management is definitely an important component of our limited grazing operations, but it's also for some of our others too that might winter cows in a dry lot or building setting. And of course we can use that manure to add value to some of the other acres on the farm. So with this project, we did take 8 manure samples from confinement buildings on the project to really try to determine kind of what we can expect in terms of the nutrient value of that manure. So there's several factors that can impact the results of these manure samples that we had. Of course, the timing that sample was taken, the time of the year, the production system of those cows, where that sample was taken, so whether it was along the bunk line or maybe in the bed pack towards the back of those barns. And then also too, kind of the dietary differences of what those cows were being fed. Lots of variation here, and you'll notice that in our standard deviation just by the range of those numbers that are reported in this table. So just as a reference, this bottom table here shows manure value from several samples that were taken from a feedlot confinement project that we did. In general, our feedlot diets are typically way more consistent in terms of the dietary feedstuffs that are provided to those animals, and definitely have a lot less forage than our cow diets do. So that's just kind of included as a ballpark to give you an idea of a comparison between the feedlots and the confined cow-calf operations. So this slide is estimating the manure value of a cow-calf system based on some of the output data that we saw on the slide before, and making some assumptions on our NP and K prices and availability that's kind of listed down here along the bottom. So based on these assumptions, basically we're looking at about $150 per cow-calf pair per year coming from the bedded cow-calf facilities. So pretty significant value that we can have there, but we also need to make sure that we include those costs of having to clean out that building and apply that manure to other farm ground. So based on estimated 13 tons of output of that manure and bedding that we have to haul out at about $7 a ton to remove that, basically we have about $85 in expenses getting that manure hauled out and applied to those fields. So when it's all said and done after application, we're looking about a $70 benefit that manure value can have to us. So more information on these calculations and managing manure can be found in our manual on page 74. So the Cow Systems manual that we've mentioned that has this data and several others throughout the project included can be found on our Iowa State Extension store. It has the link that's listed there. So there is a downloadable option as a PDF, or there are some hard copies available of this manual as well. So thank you for listening today and joining us. If you have questions, feel free to contact me directly or visit the iowabcenter.org for more information.